We are back looking at Psalm chapter 62, and yesterday we spent some time just reflecting on the main driver of the psalm, which is focusing on God in the midst of, we don't know the exact circumstances in David's life that drove him to write this, but we know that there's something that is making him have to trust in God, have to find a place of refuge, have to find a place of rest. And in the first few verses, then again, he repeats it a little bit if you look at verse 9 and 10. His charge, both to us as readers, but also to his own soul, to find rest, to see God for who he is in light of some threatening thing from the outside, something, some form of an enemy. So he says, how long will you threaten a man? How will you attack? This language of threatening and attack is directly connected to enemies. And we said we could guess maybe this is a part of when David's life, when he's running, he's literally on the run when people are after attacking and threatening for his life. Or maybe it's something else related to that. But it's important for us to know that enemies are a big part of what the Psalms do. Oftentimes we read this, and this is the part, even in public scripture reading, sometimes people just want to read the first 3 or 4 verses, and then they don't really want to say anything about these questions about enemy because we don't exactly know what to do with it. And sometimes it feels like, oh, that's something from the Old Testament and maybe not what Jesus is, because Jesus says, love your enemies. Jesus would have been reading these Psalms, and he would have been understanding them the same way. And again, because they're written 2,500, 3,500 years ago, the cultural reality in which David is reading this to say, how will I find rest in God alone? In the midst of this is that it would have been a much more visceral reality to have an enemy. This is not someone who used red ink on his spelling test in 3rd grade and therefore the teacher is his enemy, right? This is someone who, it was a savage culture and people acted in savage ways oftentimes. And the pagan practices that were true and real would have made for enemies much more like what people are feeling today in Ukraine or places where there's clear evil happening, or even that we found in our own neighborhoods in the last week. So this reality of evil and the reality of having an enemy strikes us, I think, in a unique way today to show that David looks to God in the midst of these evil circumstances. And he takes some pretty raw emotions, both here and if you look throughout the Psalms, you see where David comes to God sort of not just recognizing his enemies, but praying for justice. That God, as the judge of the world, would show up and would bring down what is true and right in the midst of this injustice that's happening inside of the world. And he prays for that. Judgment is one of the major themes of the Psalms. And sometimes it's hard for us to understand that. That reality can feel distant. It may feel closer to us now than it has in times past. But today, we want to remember, as we think about the reality of evil in the world and the reality of evil in our own lives, that David starts with God, then he shifts to his circumstances, and he doesn't ignore them, he doesn't push over them, he faces them with reality, the sober reality of that evil that's real. But then he continues on and he moves on to encourage his soul once again, verse 5, 6, and 7, to find rest in God alone. I want to read this in the Message. One of the things I do sometimes when I'm reading the Psalms is I have this Eugene Peterson, it's just of the Psalms itself. And it's a paraphrase of Psalm chapter 62. It's not a translation, but it paraphrases in a way that sometimes strikes us differently. So today, as we close and think about this, I want to read the part where he returns to this admonition to see God in light of our enemies. And he says this, God, the one and only, I'll wait as long as he says. Everything I hope for comes from him, so why not? He's solid rock underneath my feet. He's breathing room for my soul. He's an impregnable castle, so I'm set for life. My help and my glory are in God. Granite strength and safe harbor God. So trust him absolutely, people. Lay your lives on the line for him, for God is a safe place to be. All of us need a safe place for our souls, a safe place for our minds as they wander and as they struggle, specifically as we think about our enemies or the things that are threatening us, whatever that might be in your life today. So I pray that this understanding of facing the challenges and enemies of our life, that ultimately we can still return to the safe harbor of who God is in our lives.